The SEC has long been thought of as the best conference in the country, and for good reason. They've won at a higher rate than any other conference, and it's really not been close when you consider national championships. But as things continue to change and things continue to progress in our sport, could we see a changing of the guard? The SEC is very likely in danger of ending up playing second fiddle in the grand scheme of things. Who would they play that to? Well, obviously the Big Ten. The whale in the entire conference realignment conversation right now is Notre Dame. We all know this. If the Big Ten or the SEC could get the Fighting Irish into a conference, it would be an absolute game changer. However, it doesn't seem like that's happening soon. Notre Dame seems very content to play their lower revenue or non-revenue sports or non-football sports in the ACC and then be independent for football. But could the ACC folding possibly expedite that so they can get their other sports into conferences? Possibly, but I don't know how close we truly are to the ACC folding. We're at least a couple of years away as their media rights deal runs through 2027 with ESPN. But after Notre Dame, Florida State is easily the most valuable national brand in the country. And it's honestly not even close. We don't have to take the time to do a deep dive into the numbers, the TV data, the standing in college football, the ability to compete for championships, recent history, and the commitment to continuing winning. But Florida State has all of those things. At the end of the day, you think what you want about the Seminoles, but they are a top 15-ish program of all time. If you just use the last 30 years, they're easily a top 10 program of all time. But if the Big Ten pulled in Florida State, think about what the Big Ten would have compared to the SEC. The SEC obviously has a couple of national powers that have dominated college football recently in Alabama and UGA, something that no one else could even compete with or think about contending with. They've also got some programs with some pretty high ceilings that seem like they can compete for the playoff yearly, like LSU, Texas, and Oklahoma. But then outside of that, what do they have? Well, they have brands that used to be very valuable, but haven't done anything in the last couple of decades. UF, Tennessee, Texas A&M, Kentucky, Missouri. None of that strikes fear into anyone's minds or hearts. But then you can look at what the Big Ten might be able to offer. Well, your Alabama and Georgia replacements are Michigan and Ohio State. And then your next level of competing yearly for the playoff, Penn State, USC, Oregon, Washington, Florida State, Michigan State. Then your next tier, your Florida, Tennessee, South Carolina's tier, Wisconsin, Nebraska, UCLA, and more. Now, imagine if the Big Ten was able to get Notre Dame and or Clemson, UNC, Miami to join along with Florida State at some point. They'd certainly have the lion's share of brands in the country. They're spread out all over the country as opposed to just being in the Southeast region. And why does that matter? For TV deals and the money that the Big Ten continues to rake in. They also have top to bottom better teams. And that's before they were to even add Clemson, Notre Dame, UNC, Miami later. This would just be considering adding Florida State, who seems like the next domino to fall in conference realignment. Then there's the money difference. The Big Ten's media deal is already ahead of the SEC's. But what happens when they get into Florida? What happens when they get into one of the most lucrative markets in the country because they now hold that Tallahassee home? And the surrounding markets are Tampa, Jacksonville, Orlando, Atlanta. They continue to grow. They continue to add funds. Then what about recruiting? Imagine them getting into the state of Florida from a recruiting aspect. If they get FSU, they'll surely add Miami at some point, which will only help recruiting all over the Big Ten with the talent down in South Florida. Ultimately, we're not going to convince you one way or the other that the conference you cheer for or the team that's in a conference you cheer for is second fiddle. I get it. If you're an SEC fan, if you're a homer of that conference, you are going to absolutely put on for them. And I don't blame you. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to wait and see what happens with Florida State with all of this. If the SEC was able to retain Florida State, I think they would certainly cut the walls off of the Big Ten, having the more premier conference. I think that's how valuable the Seminoles are. I think that's why they're making the most noise. I think that's why they want to get out so much more than you're seeing Clemson, UNC, or Miami doing right now from the ACC. There's no one in the Big 12 that has that kind of pedigree anymore. And so whoever can get that linchpin may open the door to having the premier conference in college football. Now, if the Seminoles do end up in the Big Ten, I predict that ultimately that is what will be the leapfrog, the catalyst in putting them past the SEC in standing. Maybe they pull in a Miami later. Maybe they pull in a Notre Dame later. Maybe they pull in a UNC or a Clemson. I know that Clemson is not necessarily the talk of what everyone's thinking about adding next. But man, if they were to pull in any of those along with Florida State, they certainly would deal a serious blow to this idea that the SEC is leaps and bounds better than anyone else. It would certainly be a two-team, two-conference race, and I think it might be the one that the Big Ten has a slight advantage in. What are your thoughts? If they were able to add those teams, if they were able to add a Florida State, if they were able to go further than just adding a Florida State, how would you see the two conferences? How would you rank them? Would it be Big Ten 1, SEC 2, or the inverse, which a lot of people say it would be right now anyway? Let me know your thoughts. Newer channel. I've had some experience covering some other things, some team-specific stuff, so trying to do a little bit of a national look at college football. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Check out our other content that's on the page. Brand new. Let's get that to 1,000 subscribers really quick. Appreciate you guys for tuning in to College Football Addiction.